Hello, my spooky people. In this video, I am going to self-draft and completely make a corset. While we were moving, and I was separated from all of my crafting and sewing materials and just not able to really do anything, I was able to do some concept sketches and some ideas of future projects that I would make, and one of those is a fan-laced corset. Fan-laced corsets are kind of silly garments. They don't really make a whole lot of sense, and they kind of make it hard for a corset to be adjustable in the fact that when you pull the lacing at the back, if you're doing it all at once, which you would be with fan lacing, that means you can't really adjust specific parts of the corset to be able to make sure that that lacing panel stays parallel. I love the look of fan lace corsets. While I understand they're completely pointless and don't really make a whole lot of sense, I still love the look of them and I want to make one. And while I am prepared to make the ridiculous fan lacing, I also am going to try and make this corset in a way that without the fan lacing I can still wear it as a corset and be able to adjust it later on. Next up, let's talk about my concept sketch and then start making my new corset.
I may or may not have gone overboard with this concept design. Okay, so I know I promised last time I did embroidery that I wouldn't just do webs again, and it's not just webs. As with my bead curtain, I am inspired by those old Gothic architecture window designs and playing around with those shapes. I'm going to embroider this entire corset, but because most of this is just going to be lines, hopefully it shouldn't be too bad. This is going to be a pretty big and time-consuming project though, so this will be a two-part series. So for part one of this project, I will be focusing on making the body of the corset and not even worrying about the fan lacing or the embroidery just yet. But keeping in mind that I will be embroidering this based on the panel placement, I'm going to make this only have 4 panels per side. Normally I'd have upwards of 6 panels making up a corset half, but if I'm careful in my mock-up stage, I think I can make 4 panels work. I much prefer underbust corsets, so that's what I'm going to do here, and I'll be using a black and white color scheme here as well, as that fits with the rest of my wardrobe the best. I'm going to use the tape method to start drafting this pattern on my adjustable dress form. I have my dress form adjusted to my size, and then I'm just going to cover her in tape. Normally there would be some plastic wrap or something between the dress form and the tape, but I didn't have any or time to get any. Once she's covered in tape, I will start drawing on what I want my corset to look like, including seam placement. I'll start with the center line on the front and the back and really only focus on one half of the body, and during this I'm checking and referencing my concept sketch off screen. Once the lines are drawn and I like the shapes, I'll cut it off the dress form. I'm going to keep the other half of the tape body on the dress form just in case I need to redo a whole new pattern if I just hate it later on. Thankfully, I didn't need to do this for this project, but it's something that's happened often enough, I just do it by default now. So once I have the shapes cut out, I'm going to stick them onto some wrapping paper as flat as I can manage. It's not going to be perfect, and that's okay. Once they're stuck down, I can then draw out and smooth some of those curves, then add about a 5/8 inch seam allowance onto the sides. I'm not going to bother with the top and bottom as I'll be using bias tape, so those edges are where I want them to be exactly. Once I have that all drawn out, I'll then cut it out and use this as my first mock-up. I'm going to do several mock-ups, so for the sake of not repeating everything a bunch of times, I'll explain the process once and then skip through the others. Once I have the first version of the pattern on my wrapping paper figured out, I'll transfer that to some non-stretch bed sheets to start my first mock-up by tracing and then cutting it out. Next, I'll line up the sides and pin them all before sewing them with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'll fold over the seam allowance on the inside and make some quick boning channels and use an awl to poke a busk through, as well as some lacing in the back so I can test the fit.
This is the first mock-up. We're huge. We're pretty big. But that's totally okay. That is to be expected. First mock-up usually isn't ever very great, so I've got some spots that I do want to take in some width especially in like the side panels. I think those are pretty big and can shrink in just a little bit. I think I like my front panel as long as everything is like sitting straight, which this little shifting that my busk is doing, I think will be fixed when I get the rest of the sizing fixed. So like that's just, I can fit a whole hand almost right there in the rib cage, so that needs to be a little bit tighter. I did put some boning in here just to like give it a little bit of structure, help me actually see how this fits. Same thing with the lacing panel, that's just a pretty quick little thing I threw together for that. So this is mock-up number 1. I'm going to edit the pattern pieces and make a new mock-up.
So there's too much in the hips at the moment, and the side panels 2 and 3 are leaning in a strange way. I'm going to adjust these by about 1/2 inch on each side of the pattern piece, smoothing out the curves as I go. Once I'm happy with this, I'll make another mock-up. This time I'm going to use some zip ties as mock-up bones, as they're just easier and I have more of them.
This is mock-up number 2. We are fitting it pretty well now. This is sitting a lot straighter, a lot nicer. We got our zip ties boning in place because why cut my actual boning if I don't need to? So this is where we're at. I need to adjust these back panels, I think, next, because this needs to be more parallel going up and down my back, and it's really tight up here. I can get it really tight up here. The bottom is pretty loose back there. I can do this, but this fabric is just not holding up very well. But this is current mock-up number 2, so I'm gonna go adjust the pattern and do the next mock-up.
Okay, so we're making progress, but that lacing panel needs some help to straighten out. So I'm going to make some adjustments to that panel number 4 and then make a new mock-up.
This is mock-up number 3. So far, I think we're getting closer. We're still kind of weird shaped and the top is still too close together in the back, but also that could be just because this is zip ties in a fairly thin material. I'm not able to like really cinch everything the way I want, but I can still kind of tell. What I'm going to do next is these panels are kind of leaning back on me, so I'm going to remove a little bit of width in, like at the very top, on the top of my curves up here. On, let's see, this would be 2 and 3. I'm gonna do it on both of these panels. And I'm gonna leave 4 and 1 alone for now, so I'm just going to change up these panels next and I guess go for mock-up number 4.
So to try and fix that lean in panel 2 and 3, I will take some width out of the very top of those panels, smoothing out the curves, and then I will try again with another mock-up.
This is mock-up number 4 and I think we're finally there. I am pretty straight back here. I'm pretty happy with how that is going right now. It is pretty wide because I am expecting to have my privacy panel here with my fan laces going through that, so that's why this is pretty far apart. Normally I'd want to close that. All in all, I think I'm pretty happy with this. This is still leaning pretty far back, but meh. I think I'm pretty happy with how this looks, how it's fitting. I think I'm just gonna go ahead and start making the actual corset now.
So I have 3 fabrics that I'll be using here, and I'll cut 2 out of each pattern piece from each fabric type. I will be starting with my cotton stiffening layer, then my black cotton outer layer, and then a thicker black layer for the lining that'll be on the inside. Once it's all cut out, I'm then going to pad stitch the stiffening layer to my lining layer. I'm doing this to make sure I have as few wrinkles and shifting as possible in the final product. It's tedious, but I'm very glad I did this, and I can easily remove these stitches later on as I'm leaving loose thread tails. I'm going to do this for all 8 panels. Once I have each lining panel pad stitched, I'll then pin each side of the corset, lining it up carefully and easing it in where needed. I'll do both the lining layers and the outer layers. With them all pinned, I'll then sew every side seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Next, I need to press my seams using my tailor's ham. I'm starting with my outer layers, and I'm pressing these seams toward the back panels. Then I'll press the lining layer seams just completely open on the inside. I'm going to work on the boning channels next by using some bias tape. I'm going to overcut these by just a little bit to make sure that they don't end up too short in the corset. And then just attach them to either side of the seam on the inside of the lining layers. I'll end up with 6 total that I need to install like this per side, using the seam allowance as a guide. I'll do this by sewing on the very edge of the bias tape, which is pretty easy to do now that these seams are pressed and laying flat. Next, I'm going to attach the lining to the outer layers at the back panel number 4 with wrong sides facing out and about a 5/8 seam allowance. Once that's sewn, I'll flip it inside out and press it flat. Then I'll top stitch it with enough space for a bone to fit in, creating the last boning channel for each half of the corset. Now I need to install the bust. Starting with the loop side, I'll mark where the loops are, and then I'll pin the back to the front panel with the wrong sides facing out. I'll sew between where the loops will stick out, and I'll also go ahead and sew the other half's front panel with about a 5/8 inch seam allowance for the peg side. Once those are done, I'll flip them right side out and then press those seams flat. Next, I'll insert the loop side into its half and sew it in place using a zipper foot. Using the loops, I'll mark where the posts will be on the other half and then poke some holes using an awl. And then I'll sew it in place as well. Next, I'm going to run a stay stitch along the bottom edge of both halves, so I'll pin and ease the bottom edge in place before running a seam there with as little seam allowance as I can. This will be hidden later under some bias tape. Using the corset as a reference, I'll cut the spiral steel boning that I'm using to size and then hammer on a cap to each end so that it doesn't poke through and hurt me. I'll make double sure of that by sealing it with some glue. I'll do that 14 times for each boning channel that I made and then shove the bone into their channel when the glue is dried. To seal it off, I'm going to sew on some bias tape along the top front of both halves. I'll sew the back half down by hand with a fell stitch. Then I'll do the same thing to the bottom half. I'll sew the bias tape to the front by machine and hand stitch the back. The final step is to install the grommets and the lace. I'm not fancy enough to have a press for this, so I gotta punch the holes and install them all by hammer. Once I have them all installed, I will lace this together and we are off to the final reveal.
Oh, this came out so well. So this is by far my best corset to date. I mean, this turned out so smooth. The panels are just butter smooth. I didn't have to adjust anything after I got it finished. It was perfect. It fits amazingly well. My panels are straight. and I'm super excited. In order to make this video not be an hour long, I'm breaking it up into 2 parts. For this part, we just made the corset. Next video, I'm going to make the privacy panel and embroider this corset and then make it into a proper fan-laced corset. This came out so well and so amazing. I am beyond happy with it. Let me know what you guys thought in the comments. I love reading your guys' comments. It brightens my day. Go ahead and like the video if you liked it. Hit that subscribe button for part 2, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!